At 3 in the morning, in the middle of a February blizzard, a 22-year-old railroad brakeman climbed a ladder on the side of a moving freight car, walked across the icy roof in the dark, and turned a brake wheel by hand. Then he climbed down, ran along the track to the next car, climbed up again, and turned another wheel. And another. 30 cars, in the dark, on ice, at 40 miles an hour. This was the job, every night. The brakeman was the most important and the most expendable worker on the American railroad. More brakemen died on the job than any other occupation in 19th century America. His name was Patrick Brennan. He worked the Chicago and Northwestern line out of Council Bluffs, Iowa. On the night of February 14th, 1887, during a blizzard that dropped temperatures to 20 below zero, Patrick missed a step on an ice-covered ladder between the 14th and 15th car. His body was found the next morning, a quarter-mile back down the track, half buried in snow. He was one of 11 brakemen who died on American railroads that same night. 11 men, one night, and nobody outside the railroad yards even noticed. If you have ever ridden a train, if you have ever watched a freight train pass through your town, if you have ever wondered how those massive steel machines actually stop, this is the story of the men who stopped them by hand, the men who climbed, the men who fell, the men who built the railroad with their bodies and paid for it with their lives. Let me tell you what a railroad brakeman actually did. Picture yourself standing on a wooden platform at the back of a caboose. It is 3 in the morning. The train is moving at 35 miles per hour through open prairie. The temperature is 12 degrees. The wind is cutting through your wool coat like it is made of paper. You can feel the car swaying beneath your feet. That constant rocking motion that never lets you forget you are standing on something that wants to throw you off, and the conductor has just given you the signal. 2 blasts on the whistle. Set the brakes. Now. You grab the iron ladder on the side of the car in front of you. The metal is so cold it burns through your gloves. You have worn holes in those gloves already, just from gripping these ladders night after night. You climb, hand over hand. Your boots find the rungs by memory, because you cannot see them in the dark. There is no moon tonight. There are no lights on the train. The only illumination comes from the sparks flying off the wheels below you and the faint orange glow from the caboose stove you just left behind. You reach the top. You pull yourself onto the roof of a freight car that is 40 feet long, 10 feet wide, and moving beneath you like a living thing. The roof is not flat. Nobody tells new brakemen this before their first climb. But the roof of a freight car is curved, sloping away on both sides like the hull of an upside-down boat. This is to let rainwater run off. It also means that every step you take is a step toward an edge you cannot see. Now you walk. In summer, the roof is slick with grease and coal dust, a black film that coats everything on the railroad and makes every surface treacherous. In winter, it is a sheet of ice. Sometimes the ice is smooth and you can feel your boots losing grip with every step. Sometimes the ice is rough, frozen in ridges that catch your feet and send you stumbling. Either way, you walk heel to toe, arms out for balance, toward the brake wheel mounted at the far end of the car. The brake wheel is about 2 feet in diameter. It is connected by a long iron rod, called the brake staff, to the brake shoes underneath the car. When you turn the wheel clockwise, the rod tightens and the brake shoes press against the wheels. That is how you slow the train, 1 car at a time, 1 wheel at a time, 1 man walking through the dark, turning iron by hand. You reach the wheel. You grab it with both hands. You turn. The wheel resists. The mechanism is stiff from cold. The grease has frozen. The metal has contracted. You throw your whole body into it. You feel your back strain. You feel your shoulders burn. The wheel turns. Slowly, grudgingly. The brakes engage. You feel the car shudder beneath your feet as the brake shoes grab the wheels. 1 car done, 29 to go. You walk to the other end of the roof, 40 feet, 1 step at a time. The wind is screaming now, trying to push you off the side. You keep your center of gravity low. You do not look down. You reach the ladder on the other side of the car. You climb down, hand over hand, feeling for each rung with your boot. Here is the part that killed men. You have to drop to the ground beside the track while the train is still moving. There is no platform. There is no step. You reach the bottom rung, you let go, and you drop 3 feet onto gravel that is rushing past beneath you. If you land wrong, if your ankle turns, if you stumble, You go under the wheels. Men died this way every month, but you land clean. You have done this 1,000 times. You are running now, sprinting along the track bed, the gravel crunching beneath your boots. The next car is already passing you. You can feel the wind of it against your face. You reach out, grab the ladder, feel the metal burn your palms, and you swing yourself up onto the rungs. You are climbing again. You are on the next roof. You are reaching for the next wheel. This was not an emergency procedure. This was the routine. Every stop, every station, every grade, every curve. The engineer in the locomotive had no way to control the brakes on the cars behind him. He could only blow his whistle and hope that his brakeman heard it and responded in time. A brakeman on a 30-car freight train might climb and descend 60 ladders in a single 8-hour shift. He might walk the equivalent of 3 miles on moving rooftops in the dark. He might do this in rain, in snow, in sleet, in fog so thick he could not see his hand in front of his face. He might do this for $1.75 a day. A man named George Sampson worked as a brakeman on the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1871 to 1889, 18 years on the rooftops. In his memoirs, written when he was an old man, he described his technique for walking the cars in a blizzard. He would count his steps, 40 steps to cross a car. He would listen for the change in the wheel sound that told him he was approaching the gap between cars. He would feel for the brake wheel with his hands extended in front of him, like a blind man navigating a familiar room. He wrote that he could set the brakes on a 30-car train in under 12 minutes. That was considered fast. That was a point of pride. He also wrote that in 18 years of work, he attended the funerals of 47 men he had trained personally. 47 brakemen, dead, from one crew on one railroad in one man's career. And George Sampson was not unusual. He was typical. Every senior brakeman had a list like his. Every senior brakeman had carried coffins. If you are finding value in this, take a moment to subscribe. The statistics I'm about to share with you will make you understand why this job has been called the deadliest in American history. The numbers from this era are difficult to comprehend. They are difficult to believe, but they are documented and recorded in the annual reports of the Interstate Commerce Commission, preserved in the archives of the railroad companies, etched into the tombstones of railroad cemeteries from Maine to California. In 1889, the Interstate Commerce Commission began tracking railroad injuries and deaths for the first time. That year, they reported that 1,972 railroad workers were killed on the job. Another 20,028 were injured. Let that number settle in your mind. 20,000 injuries in 1 year on one industry. That is 54 men injured every single day. Of those killed, the largest single category was brakemen. They died at a rate nearly 4 times higher than any other railroad position. A locomotive engineer faced danger, certainly. A fireman shoveling coal worked near extreme heat and moving machinery. But neither of them had to climb ladders on moving trains in the dark. Neither of them had to walk icy rooftops at 40 miles an hour. Neither of them had to stand between 2 railroad cars and pray that the timing was right. By 1893, the numbers had gotten worse. 2,727 railroad workers killed, over 31,000 injured. The railroads were killing more Americans every year than the entire Civil War Battle of Antietam had killed in a single day. Think about that. Every year, the railroad industry produced a body count equivalent to one of the bloodiest battles in American history. And it happened every year, year after year, for decades. The brake wheel was only one half of the brakeman's job. The other half was coupling. And coupling was where men lost their hands. In the 1880s, railroad cars were connected to each other using a device called the link and pin coupler. Here is how it worked. At the end of each car was a metal pocket called a drawbar. Into this pocket, you inserted a heavy iron link, about 2 feet long and shaped like a figure 8, weighing about 15 pounds. Then, as the locomotive pushed one car toward another, the link would slide into the drawbar of the second car. At the exact moment the link was aligned, you dropped a metal pin down through a hole in the top of the drawbar to lock everything in place. The problem was the timing. You had to stand between 2 moving railroad cars, each weighing 30 tons or more, and drop that pin at the precise instant the link seated. Too early, and the pin would fall through empty air. Too late, and the cars would crush together and the pin would jam. And if you were standing in the wrong place when those two cars met, if your hand was still in the drawbar when the 30 tons of the second car slammed into the 30 tons of the first, you were finished. Most commonly, you lost your hand, or your fingers, or your arm up to the elbow. Railroad workers called the link and pin coupler the man killer. They called the space between two cars the tunnel of death. They developed their own slang for the injuries that had become routine. A man who lost fingers was shortened. A man who lost a hand was given the hook. A man who lost both hands was finished, because there was no job left on the railroad for a man who could not grip. The injuries were so common that experienced brakemen could tell a man's service record by looking at his hands. 10 years meant missing fingers. 15 years meant a hook or a prosthetic. 20 years meant you were either very lucky or very dead. In 1888, a railroad worker named John Luther Long, who later became a successful author and playwright, wrote about watching a brakeman named William Cates attempt a coupling on the Erie Railroad outside of Buffalo, New York. Cates was an experienced man, 15 years on the job. He had already lost 3 fingers on his left hand to previous couplings, taken one at a time over the years. On this particular day, the locomotive was backing too fast. Long could see it happening. He shouted a warning, but the yard was loud with the sound of engines and the clang of metal. Cates reached in to drop the pin. The cars met early. His right hand was crushed flat between the drawbars, the bones ground to powder, the flesh torn. Long wrote that Cates did not scream. He simply pulled his arm back, looked at the ruin where his hand had been, and said, "Well, that's both of them now." Then he wrapped his arm in his coat, walked to the caboose, and sat down to wait for the next station where he could see a doctor. He was back at work 6 weeks later, fitted with hooks on both arms, working as a signal caller because he could no longer climb ladders or grip wheels. This was not unusual. This was typical. The railroads did not fire men for losing their hands. They simply moved them to jobs that required fewer limbs. A railroad yard in 1890 was full of men with hooks and prosthetics, men with empty sleeves pinned to their shoulders, men who had given pieces of themselves to the machines they served. The brakeman's workplace was not just dangerous, it was designed to be dangerous. The ladders were narrow, placed on the sides of cars without guardrails or cages. The rooftops were unprotected, with no walkways and no handholds between the brake wheels at each end. The link and pin couplers required men to stand in the most dangerous position possible, and none of this was accidental. Railroad companies argued that safety features would slow down operations. Guardrails would catch on loading platforms. Walkways would add weight to the cars. Automatic couplers would be too expensive to retrofit. Safety, they argued, was the enemy of efficiency. In 1877, a pamphlet circulated among railroad executives that calculated the annual cost of brakeman deaths at roughly $800,000 in total. That figure included death benefits, legal settlements, and lost productivity. The same pamphlet calculated that installing automatic couplers on all railroad cars would cost $12 million. The math, from a pure business standpoint, was clear. Dead brakemen were cheaper than safety improvements, and so the brakemen continued to die. A brakeman in 1885 could expect to work for the railroad for about 7 years before suffering a serious injury or death. That was the actuarial average, calculated by the railroad companies themselves for insurance purposes. 7 years. If you started at 18, you would likely be dead or crippled by 25. Subscribe if you want to understand why anyone would take this job in the first place. The answer tells you everything about what America was like in those years. To understand why men took this job, you have to understand what America looked like in the 1880s. This was not a nation of opportunity for most people. This was a nation of grinding poverty, of 12-hour factory shifts, of children working in coal mines, of immigrant families packed 10 to a room in urban tenements. The average wage for a factory worker in 1885 was about $1 a day. A farm laborer might make 50 cents. A seamstress working piece rates might earn 40 cents for a 12-hour day of continuous sewing. Against this backdrop, a brakeman's wage was extraordinary. A brakeman earned between $1.50 and $2 a day, Depending on the railroad and the route, some lines paid bonuses for dangerous runs, some paid extra for night work, and on top of the wages, the railroad provided room and board in the caboose. You did not have to pay rent. You did not have to buy food, at least not while you were on the train. Your expenses were gloves, boots, and whatever you sent home to your family. For a young man with no education and no prospects, the railroad offered something that nothing else in America could offer: a wage that could support a wife and children, travel to places he would never otherwise see, a uniform that commanded respect, a title that meant something, and most importantly, the possibility of promotion. The railroad career ladder was brutally simple. You started as a brakeman. If you survived, you might become a freight conductor. If you survived that, you might become a passenger conductor. If you survived that, you might become a station master or a yard master. Each step meant more money, less danger, and more respect. But you had to survive the first step. You had to earn your way off the rooftops. And that meant years of climbing, walking, coupling, and hoping that tonight was not the night you slipped. The daily life of a railroad brakeman was governed by the train schedule and nothing else. You worked when the trains ran. You slept when they did not. And the trains ran constantly. A typical brakeman on a freight line might work a split shift. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 4 hours on again. Sometimes the shifts stretched longer. Sometimes a train was delayed and you worked 16 hours straight. There were no overtime laws. There were no maximum hour regulations. You worked until the train reached its destination or until you dropped. The off hours were spent in the caboose, a small wooden car at the end of the train that served as a mobile office, bunkhouse, and kitchen for the crew. The caboose was about 30 feet long and 8 feet wide. It had a coal stove for heat mounted in the center of the car. It had a few narrow bunks built into the walls, stacked too high. It had a table for paperwork where the conductor kept his manifests and waybills. And it had a cupola on the roof, a raised observation deck where the rear brakeman could sit and watch for signals from the engineer. The caboose was not comfortable. The bunks were hard wooden boards with thin mattresses stuffed with straw or horsehair. The mattresses smelled of coal smoke, sweat, and the accumulated grime of generations of working men. The stove was either too hot, leaving you sweating in your bunk, or not hot enough, leaving you shivering in your blankets. The motion of the train made sleep difficult. Every lurch, every stop, every curve was a jolt that could throw you out of your bunk if you were not braced against the wall. And you shared this space with 3 or 4 other men, all of them exhausted, all of them dirty, all of them carrying the particular smell of a man who has been working outdoors in all weather for days at a time. Privacy did not exist. Rest was rare, but the caboose was home. Brakemen developed a fierce attachment to their particular caboose. They decorated it with photographs of their families. They brought their own bedding, their own pillows, their own blankets from home. They kept personal items in the small lockers beneath the bunks. Some cabooses had names painted on the side by their crews: the Iowa Belle, the Prairie Queen, the Widow Maker. That last name was a grim joke, but brakemen were full of grim jokes. They had to be. A man who could not laugh at death would not last long in this work. Gallows humor was survival. It was how you processed the funerals, the injuries, the constant presence of danger. You joked about it because the alternative was to break down. The social world of the railroad was strictly hierarchical, as rigid as any military organization. At the top was the locomotive engineer, who controlled the speed of the train and was considered a skilled professional worthy of respect. The engineer wore a clean uniform. The engineer had status. Below him was the fireman, who shoveled coal into the engine and was training to become an engineer someday. The fireman was covered in soot and ash, but he had prospects. Below them was the conductor, who managed the train's cargo and crew and handled all the paperwork. The conductor was the officer of the train, responsible for everything that happened behind the locomotive. And at the bottom, doing the most dangerous work for the lowest pay, working in conditions that the engineer and conductor would never tolerate, were the brakemen. There were typically 2 brakemen on a freight train. The head brakeman worked near the front, setting brakes on the first half of the train, taking his signals from the engineer. The rear brakeman worked from the caboose, setting brakes on the back half, keeping watch through the cupola for problems on the track behind them. They communicated through a system of hand signals, lantern signals, and whistle codes that had developed over decades. One long whistle meant apply brakes. Two short whistles meant release brakes. A waving lantern meant come forward. A still lantern meant stop. A lantern swung in a circle meant back up. These signals had to be visible and understandable in all conditions: in the dark, in rain, in snow, in fog. A miscommunication could mean a collision. A missed signal could mean death. Brakemen developed their own subculture with its own language and its own rules. A shack was a brakeman. A hogger was an engineer. A beanery was a railroad restaurant. Deadheading meant riding a train without working. Highballing meant running at full speed. Getting the hook meant losing a hand to a coupler. Taking the westbound meant dying on the job. They also developed their own code of honor. An experienced brakeman was expected to help train the new men, to show them the techniques that might save their lives. A brakeman who saw another man in trouble was expected to help, even at risk to himself. And a brakeman who died on the job was given a proper funeral, paid for by his crew, with his tools buried alongside him. This was not sentimentality. This was survival. Every brakeman knew that someday he might be the one who fell. And when that day came, he wanted to know that his brothers would carry him home. The pay for all this was not much, but it was steady. A brakeman in 1885 earned between $45 and $60 a month. That was roughly twice what a factory worker made. But it came with hidden costs that ate into those wages. Brakemen had to buy their own gloves, which wore out every few weeks from gripping cold iron. They had to buy their own boots, which were destroyed by the constant climbing and running. They had to pay for their own meals when the train was stopped at stations far from the caboose. And they had to pay their own medical bills when they were injured because the railroads accepted no responsibility for worker safety. A serious injury could wipe out years of savings. A man who lost a hand might spend everything he had on hospital bills and then find himself unemployable, unable to work the railroad, untrained for anything else, dependent on charity or family. The railroads offered no pension, no disability insurance, no workers' compensation. When you were finished, you were on your own. Despite all this, the railroads remained one of the largest employers in America. By 1890, nearly 1 million men worked for the railroad companies. Of those, approximately 100,000 were brakemen. 100,000 men climbing ladders every night, walking rooftops in the dark, dropping pins between moving cars. 100,000 men playing the odds against a job that killed 2,000 of them every year. Those odds caught up with a man named Lorenzo Coffin in a way that changed American history. If you have made it this far, you understand why this story matters. Subscribe to see how one man fought to end the slaughter. Lorenzo Coffin was not a railroad worker. He was a farmer from Fort Dodge, Iowa, who had served as a chaplain in the Union Army during the Civil War. After the war, he became a reformer. We're advocating for agricultural improvement and soil conservation. In 1874, he was appointed to the Iowa Board of Railroad Commissioners, a position that gave him authority to inspect railroad operations across the state. It was during one of these inspections that Coffin's life changed. He was observing a freight train being assembled in a yard near Des Moines when he watched a brakeman attempt a coupling. The man was experienced, moving quickly between the cars, holding the link in position. The locomotive backed toward him. The cars met. And then Coffin heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the crunch of bones. The brakeman's hand had been caught between the drawbars. Coffin ran to help. He held the man's arm while other workers tried to free him from the machinery. He watched the blood pour from the wound. He watched the man's face go white with shock, and he watched the crew carry the brakeman away, knowing that this was not an accident, not a freak occurrence, but a routine event that happened in every railroad yard in America. That moment haunted him. He began investigating railroad safety, traveling across Iowa, interviewing workers, collecting statistics, documenting injuries. He visited hospitals and counted the men with missing hands. He visited cemeteries and counted the graves. What he found horrified him. In the state of Iowa alone, brakemen were being killed at a rate of 1 every 3 days. Nationally, the death toll was approaching 2,000 per year, and every single one of those deaths was preventable. The technology to save these men already existed. It had existed for years. In 1868, a young inventor from Schenectady, New York, named George Westinghouse, had patented the air brake. The system used compressed air, pumped from the locomotive through a continuous line running the length of the train, to apply brakes to every car simultaneously. Instead of 30 brakemen climbing 30 ladders, one engineer could pull a single lever and stop the entire train. The air brake worked. Westinghouse had demonstrated it. The Pennsylvania Railroad had tested it. The results were undeniable. Stopping distances were reduced by half. Emergency stops became possible, and brakemen no longer needed to climb rooftops in blizzards. But the railroads refused to install it. The argument was cost. Retrofitting every railroad car in America with air brakes would require new equipment, new airlines, new training for engineers. The railroads claimed they could not afford it. They claimed the technology was not yet reliable. They claimed that the old system worked well enough. They claimed that brakemen preferred the old system because it gave them job security. That last argument was a lie, and everyone knew it. No brakeman preferred climbing icy rooftops in the dark. No brakeman preferred standing in the tunnel of death between coupling cars. But the railroads kept saying it, kept repeating it in newspaper articles and congressional testimony, because it shifted the blame from the companies to the workers. The same situation existed with couplers. In 1873, an inventor named Eli Hamilton Janney had patented an automatic coupler that connected cars without requiring anyone to stand between them. The Janney coupler used interlocking knuckles, like two hands grasping each other, one that closed automatically when two cars came together. No link, no pin, no hand in the drawbar. The Janney coupler also worked. It had been tested on passenger trains and proven reliable. It was stronger than the link and pin system. It was faster to operate, and it would eliminate completely the injuries that were taking hands off brakemen at a rate of hundreds per year. But the railroads also refused to install it. Lorenzo Coffin spent 15 years fighting to change this. He testified before Congress. He wrote articles for newspapers. He organized workers. He gave speeches across the country, describing what he had seen, showing photographs of men with missing hands, reading the names of the dead. The railroad lobby fought him at every turn. They called him a radical. They called him a socialist. They called him an enemy of free enterprise who wanted to destroy the industry that had built America. They hired lawyers to challenge his statistics. They hired publicists to attack his character. They used their political influence to block every safety regulation that threatened their profits. But Coffin kept pushing, and slowly, public opinion began to shift. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Commission was created, giving the federal government its first real authority over railroad operations. In 1889, the ICC began publishing annual reports on railroad deaths and injuries. For the first time, the American public could see exactly how many men were dying. The numbers were printed in newspapers across the country. 1889, 1,972 dead, 20,028 injured. 1890, 2,451 dead, 22,396 injured. 1891, 2,660 dead, 26,140 injured. 1892, 2,554 dead, 28,267 injured. 1893, 2,727 dead, 31,729 injured. In 5 years, nearly 12,000 railroad workers had been killed on the job. Over 128,000 had been injured. These were not abstract numbers. These were fathers and sons, brothers and husbands, men who had walked out the door one morning and never come home. Congress could no longer ignore the issue. On March 2, 1893, President Benjamin Harrison signed the Railroad Safety Appliance Act into law. The act was simple in its requirements. It required every railroad car used in interstate commerce to be equipped with automatic couplers. It required every railroad car to be equipped with continuous air brakes that could be controlled from the locomotive. And it required every railroad car to have grab irons and handholds that would allow brakemen to move safely along the train. The railroads were given 5 years to comply. After January 1st, 1898, any car without these safety devices would be banned from interstate commerce. The penalty for violation was $100 per car per day. The railroads could no longer calculate that dead brakemen were cheaper than safety equipment. The railroad companies screamed that it would bankrupt them. They lobbied for extensions. They filed lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the act. They tried to water down the requirements, but the law held. The Supreme Court upheld it. And slowly, reluctantly, car by car and line by line, the railroads began installing the equipment that would save thousands of lives. The transformation was not instant. It took years for the railroads to retrofit their fleets. During that time, brakemen continued to climb, continued to couple, continued to die, but the numbers began to fall. By 1902, railroad worker deaths had dropped to 2,550. Still terrible, still unacceptable, but lower. By 1907, they had dropped to 2,265. By 1912, they had dropped to 1,850. By 1920, they had dropped below 1,500 for the first time in decades. The automatic coupler and the air brake were saving lives, exactly as Lorenzo Coffin had predicted, exactly as George Westinghouse and Eli Janney had promised when they invented these devices decades earlier. But the most profound change was less visible in the statistics. It was the change in what it meant to be a brakeman. Before the Safety Appliance Act, a brakeman was a climber. His job was defined by physical danger, by the constant risk of death, the rooftop walk, the icy ladder, the tunnel of death between the coupling cars. These were the brakeman's world. After the act, a brakeman became something else, a watcher, a signalman, a supervisor of machines. The new brakes worked automatically, but they still required human oversight. Someone had to check the air pressure in the brake line. Someone had to test the connections at each coupling. Someone had to walk the length of the train before departure and verify that every brake was functioning, every coupler was secure, every grab iron was in place, that someone was still called a brakeman. But his work was unrecognizable to the men who had come before. A brakeman in 1910 might spend his entire shift on the ground. He might never climb a ladder. He might never walk a rooftop. He might never risk his life at all, except in the ordinary dangers that come with working around heavy machinery. The job that had once been a death sentence had become merely a job. For the men who remembered the old ways, this was both a blessing and a loss. George Sampson, the Pennsylvania Railroad brakeman who had attended 47 funerals, lived long enough to see the change. He retired in 1905 at the age of 61, his body worn out by decades of climbing, but still intact. He had kept his hands. He had kept his life. He was one of the lucky ones. In a letter written in 1915, when he was 71 years old, Sampson described his feelings about the new system. He wrote that he was grateful. Grateful that young men no longer had to do what he had done. Grateful that the funerals had stopped. While grateful that his grandsons could work on the railroad without their wives crying every night. But he also wrote that something had been lost. The old brakemen had been a brotherhood, bound together by shared danger and shared skill. They had taken pride in their ability to walk the rooftops, to set the brakes, to do what other men could not. They had been, in their own way, craftsmen of a dangerous art. The new brakemen were safer. But they were also, Sampson wrote, more ordinary. The job that had once required courage now required only attention. And that was probably a good trade, but it was still a trade. He ended his letter with a list of names, 47 names, the men he had trained, who had died on the rooftops. He wrote that he wanted someone to remember them, because the world had already forgotten. Patrick Brennan, William Cates, Lorenzo Coffin, George Sampson, George Westinghouse, Eli Janney. These names have mostly disappeared from history. You will not find them in textbooks. You will not see monuments erected in their honor. The Railroad Safety Appliance Act of 1893 is a footnote in labor history, studied by specialists and ignored by everyone else. But the next time you see a freight train pass through your town, I want you to think about what it took to stop that train. Not the physics of it, not the engineering, the men. For 50 years, from the end of the Civil War to the turn of the 20th century, American railroads were stopped by human hands. Men climbed ladders in the dark. Men walked icy rooftops at 40 miles an hour. Men stood between 30-ton cars and dropped pins into drawbars and hoped their reflexes were fast enough to save their fingers. 2,000 of them died every year. 2,000 men, roughly 5 or 6 per day, every single day for decades. That is more than the casualties of many American wars. That is more than the death toll of most natural disasters. And it happened every year, year after year, in plain sight of a nation that considered itself civilized. The railroads made America. They connected the coasts. They moved the goods. They transformed a collection of isolated regions into a continental economy. But the railroads did not build themselves. They were built by men who bled for them, men who died for them, men whose names we do not know. When George Westinghouse invented the air brake in 1868, he was 22 years old. In the same age as Patrick Brennan when he fell from that freight car in Iowa. Westinghouse lived to be 67. He became one of the wealthiest men in America. He was celebrated as a genius, a captain of industry, a builder of the modern world. He deserved that celebration. The air brake was a genuine innovation, and Westinghouse had the vision and the persistence to make it work. But the air brake did not save lives because it was invented. It saved lives because the law required it to be used. And that law did not pass because of engineering genius. It passed because men like Lorenzo Coffin spent 15 years shouting about the dead, because workers organized and demanded change, because the public finally saw the numbers and refused to look away. The technology was ready in 1868. The law did not pass until 1893. For 25 years, the railroads had the ability to stop killing their workers and chose not to. They chose profit over people. They chose efficiency over ethics. They chose the balance sheet over human lives. And 2,000 men per year paid the price. This is the debt we owe, not to the inventors, not to the executives, not to the entrepreneurs who built the railroad fortunes. We owe a debt to the brakemen, the shacks, the men who climbed. They are gone now. All of them. The last of the old-style brakemen died decades ago, taking their memories with them. The rooftops they walked are rusted and forgotten. The brake wheels they turned have been replaced by electronics. The link and pin couplers that took their hands have been melted down for scrap. But the brakes on the train you ride today still work. The couplers still connect. The wheels still turn, and somewhere in that machinery, if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear the echo of men running along the tracks in the dark, climbing ladders they cannot see, reaching for wheels that might kill them, doing the job that had to be done because someone had to do it. 3 a.m. February, a blizzard, 20 below zero. A 22-year-old man climbs a ladder on the side of a moving freight car. He walks across the icy roof in the dark. He reaches for the brake wheel. He turns it. 1 car done. 29 to go. This is what it cost to stop a train. This is what it cost to build America. This is what we owe to the men who did it. Remember them.